Agam Belajar.
Contractors working on a roof. Contractors are to carry out maintenance work on a roof, and working at height cannot be avoided. Outline measures to consider to help reduce the risk of injury to contractors and others. The measures to consider to help reduce the risk of injury to contractors and others include the initial completion of a risk assessment of the work to be carried out, the production of a method statement detailing the safe system of work to be followed, the provision of safe means of access to the place of work, the provision of roof edge protection such as guardrails and toe boards to prevent the fall of persons and materials from the roof. If the provision of this type of protection was not practicable, then the use of other equipment such as safety harnesses with adequate fixing points and/or nets might be necessary. Identify areas of the roof containing fragile materials, to mark them with barriers or signs, and to prevent falls through them by the use of covers. The possible provision of a hoist to transport tools, equipment and materials to the roof. The use of chutes should be considered for the removal of rubbish. The use of competent personnel fully briefed and aware of the risks involved and the precautions to be observed. Draw up procedures to deal with any emergency that might occur. Work on a flat roof. Outline the precautions that may be needed when carving out repairs to a flat roof of a building. Before starting repair works, the occupants to be informed about the work that is to take place and the precautions which they should observe. Protection for person falling from height. Edge protection to prevent person fall from height by providing proper guarding of edges. Protection for falling materials. Toe boards at least 150 mm high to be fixed to prevent materials falling from the roof. Restricted entry by providing entry pass or visitor's log. Public visitor entry to be restricted by providing barriers or warning signs. Access egress proper and safe access and egress be provided by scaffolding or access platform, mechanical or electrical, or by ladders. Suitable controls to be taken in the use of chemical agents by providing personal protective equipment and preventing the entry of chemicals through the inhalation, ingestion or absorption by prohibiting eating, drinking and smoking in work areas. Appropriate protective equipment to be used: gloves, hard hat, goggles, personal fall arrest equipment inapplicable, etc. Environmental and climatical controls to be introduced as appropriate. Waste materials are to be transported in a skip covered by a net. The fixing of a suitable and sufficient safety net below the work area under the roof by competent persons can prevent persons and/or materials from falling onto areas below. Electrical tools to be used with electricity control measures such as proper earthing, insulation and protection. Use of low voltage work equipment will be more suitable for working on roofs. Presence of asbestos cannot be neglected if the roofing material is of a sheet nature. Adequate clearance shall be maintained from overhead services. Work on a sloping roof. Outline the precautions to be taken when repair work is to be carried out on the sloping roof of a building. are a number of precautions that need to be taken in such a situation, including the use of competent and trained persons, undertaking a risk assessment to identify hazards and adequacy of controls, working to a safe system of work, the display of appropriate warning signs, for example fragile roof, use crawling boards, etc. The provision of suitable and sufficient equipment including roof edge barriers or scaffold, roof ladders or other suitable and sufficient access equipment, crawling boards, toe board or scaffold fanning, availability of suitable and sufficient means of safely lowering broken tiles and materials, a properly inspected and erected hoist, or the provision of an enclosed debris chute into skips 1. Electrical isolation. Where barriers cannot be erected, the use of fall arrest devices such as safety net and harness. The provision of adequate training and supervision will also be required. Scaffold loading bay. Identify, by means of a labeled sketch, the main requirements for a loading bay on a scaffold in order that materials for bricklayers and roofers can be safely placed on the bay by a forklift truck. Independent tied scaffold, protection of the public. An independent tied scaffold is to be erected on a building in a busy town center location. Outline the precautions that should be taken to reduce the risk of injury to members of the public during erection and use of the scaffold. The situation outlined in the question is one seen often in town centers. The precautions that should be taken in such a situation should include excluding the public from the area where the scaffold is to be erected, obtaining a temporary pavement or even street closure if this is thought to be necessary, undertaking the erection work in the quiet hours such as early evening or late evening, erecting fans, tunnels and nets, using barriers and signs to direct the public away from the operation, taking care not to raise or lower materials over areas where members of the public are likely to be present, storing scaffold materials safely on site, erecting cones and signs to direct traffic flow, preventing unauthorized access to the scaffold by boarding over the access ladder, using an internal hoist and door chutes, providing a close-boarded working platform with toe boards and guardrails, providing a good standard of lighting for enclosed walkways and ensuring the initial erection and subsequent regular inspections of the scaffold are carried out by competent personnel. Roofing contractor, fragile roof working and independent tied scaffold. A roofing contractor is required to carry out extensive repair work on a fragile roof on a large manufacturing building. A. Outline the factors that should be considered in the selection process for hiring the roofing contractor. B. Identify the main risks to the contractors from working at height. C. Identify possible control measures for the erection of an independent tied scaffold. Part A. In deciding which contractor should be chosen for a task, the following should be considered. Do they have an adequate health and safety policy? Can they demonstrate that the person responsible for the work is competent? Can they demonstrate that competent safety advice will be available? Do they monitor the level of accidents at their work site? Do they have a system to assess the hazards of a job and implement appropriate control measures? Will they produce a method statement, which sets out how they will deal with all significant risks? Do they have guidance on health and safety arrangements and procedures to be followed? Do they have effective monitoring arrangements? Do they use trained and skilled staff who are qualified where appropriate? Judgment will be required, as many construction workers have had little or no training except training on the job. Can the company demonstrate that the employees or other workers used for the job have had the appropriate training and are properly experienced and, where appropriate, qualified? Can they produce good references indicating satisfactory performance? Part B. Falling from height. Being struck by falling materials. Scaffold collapse, poorly maintained access equipment, overloading. Contact with overhead surfaces and structures. Fragile roof surfaces, falling through. Weather. Access equipment being struck by passing vehicles. Slips, trips and falls, inappropriate maintained walkways. Unprotected edges. Deterioration of materials. Part C. Scaffolding must only be erected by competent people who have attended recognized training courses and who are authorized to do the work. Any work carried out on the scaffold must be supervised by a competent person. Any changes to the scaffold must be done by a competent person. Adequate toe boards, guardrails and intermediate rails must be fitted to prevent people or materials from falling. The scaffold must rest on a stable surface. Uprights should have base plates and timber sole plates if necessary. The scaffold must have safe access and egress. Work platforms should be fully boarded with no tipping or tripping hazards. The scaffold should be sited away from or protected from traffic routes so that it is not damaged by vehicles. Lower level uprights should be prominently marked in red and white stripes. The scaffold should be properly braced, secured to the building or structure. Overloading of the scaffold must be avoided. The public must be protected at all stages of the work. Regular inspections of the scaffold must be made and recorded.